In the warm heart of Ensuka, a town wrapped in red earth and whispers of fortune, lived a woman known by everyone as Madame Ebel. She was the wife of a prosperous trader, Chief Namdi, and their mansion sat proudly at the edge of the town like a crown on a queen's head. Yet, beneath the walls of wealth and laughter, lay a silence that haunted her nights, a silence born from childlessness. For 15 long years, Madame Ebel had tried everything her faith and culture offered. She fasted, prayed, visited prophets, climbed prayer mountains, and swallowed every herbal potion that promised to bless her womb. But each moon came and went with no sign of pregnancy, and every woman in her circle had begun to whisper that her riches were bought with the sacrifice of her own fertility. Though she pretended not to care, her heart broke each time she heard those cruel words. She longed for a child, one to carry her name, one to call her mama. Her husband, ever patient, had once suggested adoption, but Ebel refused fiercely, believing that blood defined destiny. She often said, "A tree grows only from its seed, not another's," dismissing the idea that love could be stronger than lineage. But one quiet dawn, her world shifted. Her gatekeeper rushed into her room, his voice trembling with confusion. "Madam, madam, there is a baby at the gate, wrapped in a thin blue cloth, a newborn," cried as though heaven itself had sent her to announce a miracle. Ebel stood still, her eyes wide in disbelief. She hesitated, unsure whether to see the child as a blessing or a bad omen. But the soft cries melted her heart. Against her fears, she lifted the baby into her arms, and for the first time in years, she felt warmth flow through her chest like sunrise after a storm. The child's eyes, bright and innocent, seemed to speak words of destiny. Remembering the words of her friends, adopted children open doors of blessings, Ebel decided to keep her. She named the baby Zuri, meaning beautiful, and from that day, the mansion that once echoed with emptiness began to hum with laughter. She fed her, sang to her, and watched her tiny fingers wrap around her own. For years, Zuri grew like a flower, watered with love, brilliant, talkative, and full of light. Even Chief Namdi would often say, "This girl carries the spirit of joy." Everyone admired her and called her a miracle. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. One night, during dinner, the little girl looked up at her mother and said something strange. "Mama, there's a baby inside your belly." The adults laughed, dismissing it as childish talk. Yet, 2 weeks later, Ebel fainted while cooking. When the doctor told her she was pregnant, tears rolled down her cheeks. She could hardly believe it. After 15 years, her womb had finally opened. She rushed home, shouting with joy, "My prophecy child. You said there was a baby in my belly, and there is." She lifted the girl in her arms and danced across the marble floor, her laughter echoing through the hall. For months, her pregnancy glowed with peace, and when the time came, she gave birth to a son, her pride and proof that God had remembered her. People celebrated, gifts poured in, and Ebel's joy knew no bounds. Yet deep within her heart, a seed of fear began to grow, fear that the child she once adopted might one day stand in the way of her real blood. And in that tiny seed of fear lay the root of everything that would come to destroy the peace she had prayed for all her life. Years rolled by in the Ebel mansion, and little Zuri blossomed like morning dew on hibiscus leaves. Her laughter filled every corner, her curiosity painted joy across the dullest days, and her brilliance amazed even her teachers. The neighbors often whispered with admiration, saying, "That girl is touched by grace." Madame Ebal dressed her in the finest Ankara gowns, braided her hair with beads that sang when she walked, and proudly introduced her as her daughter wherever she went. For 5 golden years, Zuri was the heartbeat of the home's child, who brought laughter, peace, and color into Ebal's once quiet world. But as soon as baby Chuka was born, everything began to shift like clouds before a storm. At first, the change was gentle, almost unnoticeably. Few missed hugs, fewer stories before bed, colder tones when Zuri called her mama. Then one day, Ebal's friend, Madame Chica, came visiting. As they drank palm wine on the balcony, Chica leaned closer and whispered, "Be careful, my sister. That girl you picked from the street one day, she might claim everything your son should own. Don't let her shadow outshine your blood." The words sank deep into Ebel's heart like poison. That night, as she watched her 2 children sleep side by side, she found herself staring longer at Chukatha, one born of her flesh hand, wondering if loving both equally was betrayal. From then on, the distance grew. She began correcting Zuri for little mistakes, withholding the tender words she once gave freely, and reminding her that she was not truly one of them. Zuri tried her best to win her mother's heart again. She cleaned the house, helped the maids, studied harder, but every act of love seemed to be met with cold silence. When Ebel smiled now, it was only for Chuka. The mansion that once echoed with 2 children's laughter now carried the sound of one Chuka's. Zuri's smile began to fade. Her voice, once bright as a bell, turned quiet and unsure. Yet she never stopped calling her mama. She never stopped hoping that one day love would return. Her father, Chief Namdi, noticed the change and spoke softly to his wife. "Ebel," he said, "remember, love is not measured by blood. That child has done no wrong." But Ebel, clouded by fear and pride, refused to listen. "You don't understand," she replied sharply. "If I don't put her in her place, she'll forget where she came from." The chief sighed deeply, praying that the woman he married would one day see the truth. Time moved forward, but the wound between mother and daughter grew wider. Zuri learned to stay out of the weight, to speak only when spoken to, and to hide her tears where no one could see. But even in pain, she refused to hate. When Chuka took her toys and mocked her, she smiled. When her mother scolded her unfairly, she bowed her head and whispered, "Yes, Mama." People who visited the house could sense something was wrong, but no one dared to ask. Behind those golden walls lived a girl, slowly fading from her mother's heart. One fateful evening, as the sun melted behind the palm trees, Zuri overheard her mother say to a visitor, "I only have one child, my son." The words sliced through her chest like glass. She ran to her room and cried silently into her pillow, her little body trembling. It was then that she promised herself she would never stop being kind, even to those who hurt her, because deep down she still believed that love, no matter how broken, could be mended. But destiny, always listening, had other plans in store for her, plans that would test her strength, her patience, and the very meaning of love itself. The wind outside the Ebal mansion carried the smell of rain, but inside, storms were already brewing. Zuri had grown into a graceful young girl of 10, her face bright like dawn after a heavy night, her spirit still gentle despite the thorns that surrounded her. She was no longer the center of her mother's love, but had become a shadow in her own home, silent, obedient, always trying not to upset anyone. Chief Namdi adored her still, often sneaking small gifts into her hands, whispering, "My sunshine, don't ever lose your light." Yet even his protection could not shield her from the coldness that had taken root in Madame Ibal's heart. Chuka, now 5, had inherited his mother's pride. He was pampered like a prince, his mistakes excused, his arrogance encouraged. Servants bowed to him as if he ruled the house, while Zuri worked quietly beside them, helping with chores that were once done for her. One humid afternoon, Zuri returned from school to the sound of shouting. Her brother stood in the living room, screaming at their nanny. "You work for me. You do what I say," he yelled, stamping his small feet. The woman stood trembling, holding back tears. Zuri, with her usual calmness, stepped forward. "Chuka, that's not right," she said softly. "She's older than you. You must show her respect." Her voice was gentle, but firm, the voice of reason in a house that had forgotten balance. But Chuka, spoiled by endless praise, felt insulted. He began to cry loudly, pointing at Zuri, just as their mother entered. Abel froze at the scene, her precious son weeping, her adopted daughter standing tall beside him. Without asking a single question, she stormed across the room and struck Zuri across the face. The slap cracked through the air like lightning. "How dare you speak to my son like that?" she shouted, her eyes blazing. "Who gave you the right to correct him? You're not even my child." The words landed harder than the slap itself. Zuri's cheeks burned with pain, but her heart burned even more. Tears welled in her eyes, yet she whispered, "He was being rude, Mama." "Don't call me that," Ebal screamed. "From today, never call me mother again. You have no blood here. You're only here because I was foolish enough to pity you." She turned to the servants. "From now on, she will sleep in the storeroom and do house chores. If she refuses, throw her out." The servants stood frozen, unable to move. Chief Namdi, who had just arrived home, walked in to see Zuri, on her knees, her face wet with tears. "What is this?" he demanded. Ebal folded her arms coldly. "I'm putting her in her place before she grows wings." Namdi's face hardened with disappointment. "This is wickedness, Ebal. She is our daughter." But his wife snapped, "She's yours, not mine." That night, Zuri's beautiful room was emptied. Her fine clothes were taken away, replaced with a maid's uniform. She slept on a mat in the store, her pillow wet with tears. Days turned into weeks. She swept the floors, washed the dishes, and ironed the very clothes she once wore with pride. Chuka mocked her often, calling her house girl. Still, Zuri carried no bitterness. She whispered prayers each night, asking for strength. And every morning she greeted her mother with a smile, even if none was returned. The other maids pitied her and whispered, "This child carries the patience of an angel." They were right, because even when the world turned against her, Zuri's heart refused to harden. But deep within her, a quiet ache grew, a longing to understand why love had been taken away from her so cruelly. She didn't know it yet, but the truth behind her pain was greater and older than she could imagine. And one day it would come crashing through their lives like a flood that no one could stop. Days passed into months, and the rhythm of the Ebal mansion changed like a song that had lost its melody. Zuri, once a cherished daughter, had become an invisible hand that swept, washed, and cooked without being seen. Her laughter, once the heartbeat of the home, had turned into echoes swallowed by silence. She worked with quiet grace, her spirit bruised but not broken. Chief Namdi often watched her from afar, guilt written across his face. He wanted to defend her, but every time he tried, Ibo's bitterness turned sharper, her voice slicing through peace like a blade. She had become someone he no longer recognized, a woman consumed by envy and fear, blinded by the illusion of protecting her bloodline. One afternoon, the mansion shimmered with sunlight as Zuri carried laundry across the compound. Chuka, now older, sat with his friends near the veranda. They laughed loudly, careless and arrogant, mocking her as she passed. "Look at the house girl pretending to be madam," one boy sneered. Zuri ignored them, keeping her eyes low. But as she walked by, Chuka reached out and smacked her from behind, his laughter echoing cruelly through the courtyard. "It's not even soft," he shouted, sending the boys into a fit of laughter. Zuri froze, the sting on her body nothing compared to the sting in her heart. She turned slowly, her eyes glistening with tears. "Chuka, you must never speak or act like that again," she said, her voice trembling but calm. "That's not how you treat a woman." Her words, though gentle, carried truth, and that truth pierced Chuka's pride. The boy began to scream angrily, drawing attention from inside the house. Madame Ibel, hearing her son's cries, rushed out like a lioness defending her cub. "What happened here?" she shouted. "Mama, she insulted me," Chuka wailed, pointing at Zuri. Without pausing to ask, Ibal's rage flared. "So you dare talk back to my son again?" she roared. Before Zuri could explain, another slap struck her face, harder than the last. "Who do you think you are? You should be grateful I even let you breathe in my house." She spat. Zuri's tears fell freely, her voice shaking. "He touched me, Mama. He was wrong. And so what if he did?" Ebel snapped. "You dare question me, kneel down and apologize to him right now." The maids watching trembled with disbelief, some turning away so they wouldn't cry. Zuri's knees hit the marble floor, her palms pressed together. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her tears splashing onto the tiles. Chuka folded his arms proudly, a smug smile creeping across his face. Madame Ibal stood tall, satisfied with her daughter's humiliation. "Never forget your place," she hissed. "You are nothing in this house." And with those words, she turned away, dragging her son by the hand. Zuri stayed kneeling long after they left, her shoulders shaking, her heart bleeding quietly inside her chest. The mansion, once filled with songs and prayers, now felt like a prison. That night, as she sat alone in the storeroom, she heard voices echoing from the parlor, her mother arguing with Chief Namdi. "You will not send that child away," the chief's voice thundered. "Have you forgotten how she came into our lives? You prayed for a child, and God sent her to our gate. That girl brought blessings to this home." But Ebal's voice cut him off. "She's not my daughter. I won't let her steal what belongs to my son." The argument ended with silence, and a few hours later, the chief left for a business trip to Abuja, promising to return in 2 days. By morning, the mansion was tense. Ebal moved about with anger burning under her skin, and Zuri, exhausted and heartbroken, tried to keep out of sight. But destiny was already moving. That evening, just as she packed her few belongings in a small bag, a scream tore through the air. Ebel's voice filled the halls raw, trembling, and full of despair. Zuri rushed out and found her mother collapsed in front of the television. A plane had crashed near Abuja. Chief Namdi was on that flight. The mansion that once glowed with pride now fell under the shadow of sorrow. Ebel's cries pierced the night as servants wept around her. Zuri stood still, her world spinning. Her only protector was gone. She wanted to run to her mother, to hold her, but fear held her still. In that single night, the woman who once ruled her home with fire was left broken, and the little girl who was despised would soon be the keeper of secrets no one could imagine. The following morning arrived, heavy with morning clouds. The once vibrant Ebal mansion had become a house of tears. Black fabric hung on the gates, candles flickered in corners, and the sound of wailing drifted through the air. Chief Namdi's death had struck like thunder in clear skies, leaving everyone broken. Madame Ebel sat on the floor, her wrapper loose, her eyes hollow and swollen from crying. Zuri stood a few feet away, clutching a tray of water, unsure whether to comfort her or stay silent. The chief's lawyer arrived that afternoon, dressed in black and carrying a briefcase that seemed to weigh more than gold. His face was calm but serious. "Madam," he said, "Chief left instructions that his will must be read immediately in the presence of his family, including Miss Zuri." The room went still. Ebel's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "Zuri? She's not family. Why would my husband include her?" she shouted. The lawyer, undisturbed, opened the briefcase and unfolded the papers. "These are the chief's words, madam, not mine." As he began to read, his voice filled the air like the sound of judgment. "I, Chief Namdi, being of sound mind and body, hereby leave all of my wealth, properties, estates, and accounts to my beloved mother-in-law, Mama Njosi, the woman who truly showed me love. She will decide how to share it between my immediate family and my daughter Zuri." The words landed like a thunderclap. Ebal's mouth fell open. "Mother," she stammered. "He gave everything to that woman. And who is her daughter Zuri?" The lawyer closed the will gently, his eyes heavy with pity. "Those were his final wishes," he said. Ebal screamed, her voice breaking with rage. "No, this is witchcraft. That child and her grandmother have bewitched my husband." She turned on Zuri, her voice dripping with venom. You've ruined my life. You killed my husband, you stole his love, and now you steal everything else." She lunged toward the girl, but the maids held her back as she shouted and cursed through her tears. The lawyer, calm and composed, handed her a sealed envelope. "Chief instructed that you read this after hearing the will," he said softly. "Inside is an address. He said you would find your answers there." Ebel snatched the envelope, trembling with fury. "Answers? I'll find that woman and drag the truth from her myself." Hours later, she set out alone, her car speeding through the dusty outskirts of Nsukka until she arrived at a small compound surrounded by banana trees. She stepped out, her heart pounding, anger burning in her chest. A young woman stood by the doorway, her face calm, her eyes deep with sorrow and grace. She looked familiar, too familiar. "Who are you?" Ebal demanded, her voice shaking. The woman's voice was soft but steady. "My name is Ifananya," she said. "You must be Madame Ebo." "Yes," Ebo snapped. "Where is Mama Njosi? I want to see her now. Tell that which I know, what she's done." The young woman looked at her sadly and said, The woman you're looking for is standing right here. Ebel froze. The words hung in the air like smoke. What nonsense are you talking about? She whispered, her breath trembling. Mama and Josie is my mother, Ifonanya continued quietly. She's your mother, too. Silence fell like a hammer. Ebal's knees went weak. What did you just say? She gasped. Tears welled in Ifunanya's eyes as she began to speak. Years ago, you got pregnant by a man who abandoned you. You gave birth to a baby girl, but you were young, scared, and poor. So, you left her at an orphanage. That baby was me. Ebel staggered back, her heart pounding. Her mind raced through buried memories. A crying infant, a rainy night, an orphanage gate. No, no, that's not possible, she muttered, shaking her head. But Ifunanya stepped closer, her voice trembling, yet full of truth. I searched for you for years. When I found out who you were, I wanted to meet you, but I saw the life you had built. You were rich, happy, respected. I didn't want to bring shame or pain. When I gave birth to my daughter and couldn't raise her alone, I left her where I knew destiny would bring her home at your gate. That child, Zuri, is your granddaughter. The words shattered the air. Ebal's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. My granddaughter, she whispered, collapsing to her knees. Memories flooded her like rain. The baby's cries at her gate, her love, her rejection, her cruelty. She had cursed the very blood that came from her own flesh. For years, she had hated the child who was her destiny, the one who carried the love she had once thrown away. The truth burned like fire in her chest as she broke down, weeping, God forgive me. Ifonanya knelt beside her, her tears mixing with hers. 2 generations of pain lay bare before them. A mother and daughter, finally reunited through grief, guilt, and grace. And though the sky outside grew darker, a quiet light began to bloom inside their hearts, the first flicker of healing after years of brokenness. Night fell softly over Insuka, carrying the scent of rain and redemption. In the dim light of Ifonanya's humble home, 2 women sat facing each other, one burdened by years of pride and guilt, the other glowing with quiet strength. Between them lay the ashes of secrets that had burned for decades. Madame Ebo's hands trembled as she stared into her daughter's eyes. The daughter she had abandoned, the one she never knew she would find through pain. I did not know, she whispered, her voice breaking like glass. All these years, I thought I was protecting my family, but I was destroying it with my own hands. Ifonanya reached out gently, her voice calm like the stillness after a storm. Mama, you were lost, but you are found now. The past is behind us. What matters is that we still have time to make things right. Her words melted the last pieces of ice inside Ebel's heart. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her daughter's hands and sobbed, "Forgive me. I beg you, forgive me." And Ifunana, without hesitation, pulled her mother into an embrace, one that erased years of pain, replacing it with the warmth of blood that had finally recognized itself. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of fresh rain, the smell of renewal. The next morning, they returned together to the mansion. The servants were stunned to see Ebal walking hand in hand with a woman they had never met. Zuri, still unaware of the truth, stood frozen at the doorway, clutching a broom. When her grandmother's eyes met hers, time seemed to stop. Ebel's voice trembled as she said, "Zuri, come to me." The girl hesitated, afraid it was another trick. "Please, my child," Ebel whispered, her tears falling freely. "I have done you wrong. I have hurt you more than words can measure. But God has shown me the truth. You are my blood, my granddaughter." The broom slipped from Zuri's hands. Her eyes widened, confusion and disbelief flooding her face. "Your granddaughter," she stammered. Ebal nodded, stepping forward and falling to her knees before the girl. "Yes, my daughter's child, the one I once found by my gate, the one I thought was a stranger. I was blind, Zuri, but now I see. Forgive me, please," the servants gasped. Even Chuka, standing at the staircase, froze in silence. Zuri's small hands trembled as she bent down and touched her grandmother's shoulders. "Mama, please, stand up," she whispered softly. "I forgive you." And in that moment, the mansion that had long echoed with bitterness filled once again with light. The air felt lighter, as if the very walls had been waiting for this peace to return. Ifunanya entered quietly and wrapped her arms around both of them. For the first time in many years, 3 generations of women, mother, daughter, and granddaughter, stood united under the same roof, not by blood alone, but by the strength of grace. Over the weeks that followed, the house changed. The laughter that had once belonged only to Chuka now belonged to everyone. Zuri returned to school, no longer as a servant, but as the daughter of the house. Madame Ebal donated much of her wealth to orphanages across Enugu, saying, "I cannot undo my past, but I can heal what is broken in others." Even Chuka began to soften, watching his grandmother and sister with new respect. At night, they often sat together on the veranda, telling stories under the moonlight, stories of love, loss, and second chances. One evening, as the wind rustled through the palm trees, Zuri asked softly, "Mama, do you think my grandfather sees us?" Ebel smiled through tears. "Yes, my child," she said. "He sees, and he smiles, because he always knew love would find its way home." And when the rain began to fall gently over the compound, washing away the dust of sorrow, the 3 generations stood together, arms intertwined, their hearts beating in rhythm with the sound of forgiveness. It was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something new, a story where love had finally remembered its name.